What's up, everybody? How you doing today? My name is Frank Reynolds. Welcome in to another episode of Is It Worth It? I review books and movies across all genres, let you know which are worth your time. Today, we're staying on that Dune train here. We've just recently reviewed the new movie that came out. We also talked about the book a couple weeks back. Right now, we're gonna do a shorter review hitting on the sequel to the novel. It's something I usually don't do, sequels of old, but given how there is a potential for this to be a concluding chapter of a movie trilogy, I think it's worth talking about if you decide to read that first book so that you know whether or not you should indulge in the second. That, of course, is Dune Messiah. Dune Messiah was released in 1969, 4 years after the original novel, and at the time, it was seen as a massive disappointment. People have grown to love it over the years, specifically certain cult followings, but on the whole, a lot of people don't look at Dune Messiah the same way they look at the first book. I can certainly see why after reading the novel, but I'm here to let you know that Dune Messiah just might be worth your time if you give it a chance. For one, it is brave. It takes the Dune story in a totally different direction from what we are accustomed to in the first book. Dune is a classic hero's journey with coming-of-age elements. Dune Messiah is more Shakespearean in that it is a tragedy, and I don't think at the time a lot of people knew what to do with that. They wanted to see more of what we saw in the first book, when in reality, a lot of the fallout from that first novel would play out like it does here in Dune Messiah. This is a realistic version of what would happen if the events of Dune happened. It's gritty, it's dark. Honestly, you can see the inspiration in classic movie trilogies of the future. Star Wars, for example. Star Wars: A New Hope is very much like Dune in that it's a feel-good coming-of-age type of story, and Empire Strikes Back is much darker. You can look at it as a tragedy in many different ways. That is the case here with Dune Messiah. There are a lot of interesting parallels to the original classic, but it takes a lot of the story in a different way. It was never going to make everybody happy. What it does do is expand the world of Dune tremendously, like a lot. It's not always good, but it certainly opens the door and shows us what Dune universe 8,000 years into the future from where we are presently should be. I mean, these new elements greatly impact the story, and the plot is built around them. The characters, their motivations, and the ways they're driven are built around these new elements here. So again, credit Frank Herbert for being brave and taking that step and trying something new. In a lot of ways, you can think of Dune Messiah as a book 4 rather than a book 2. Remember, Dune is actually broken up into 3 sort of novellas, right? Dune Messiah is about the same length as those, and if we want to look at it as a book 4, it is the most well put together of the 4. It's the most balanced. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's satisfying in all regards, in all of those specific regards anyway. Another thing I want to touch on really quickly is the writing. I mean, Frank Herbert has done the exact same thing he did in Dune and provided us with exquisite poetry. It's addicting. It's awesome. He is a master with a pen in hand, and it's on full display here just as it was in the first novel. Some people might be turned off by the decisions our protagonists make here and the direction that their characters go. I was not one of them. Again, this is a realistic portrayal of what might happen given what happened in Dune, right? And for me, it makes a lot of sense, and it works well. And it's because of this that this novel does something I've never really seen before. It serves as a 2-part conclusion to Dune, while also working as a middle entry of a trilogy. Let me explain. You could read Dune Messiah and be done with the series and feel satisfied. You could also read Dune Messiah with the intention of reading Children of Dune and maybe some of the novels beyond, and also feel satisfied. There's certain foreshadowing here for future novels, specifically Children of Dune, the 3rd novel in the original trilogy. And there's also a solid conclusion that wraps a lot of stuff up. it works really well like that. It's very Hollywood. I can understand why they're thinking about making this the final entry of a movie trilogy. And if it does well, I'm sure that there will be talks to make Children of Dune a movie trilogy as well. But it gives them flexibility in Hollywood, and I understand that now. I mean, overall, Dune Messiah is a pretty good sequel. I went into this with lower expectations given some of the reviews I read, not only from the 60s, but in present day. And I disagree with a lot of them. I liked Dune Messiah. It's not as good as Dune. There are a lot of issues with the book, but it's a pretty solid novel. I do want to touch on some of these issues, though, because they might be a bigger problem for certain audiences than myself. For one, some of these new elements that are introduced that I applauded Frank Herbert for trying are too drastic. They're not even introduced in book one. And when I say that, I mean that had Frank Herbert talked about some of the new storytelling devices that he uses in book two in the first novel, it only would have needed a sentence or a paragraph here and there to make it believable. Had he done that, yeah, I'd be okay with it. But so much of this gets weird. It gets very sci-fi / even fantasy. And it almost came off a bit lazy. Instead of using all that you established in the first one, you feel the need to introduce some stuff in the second book that's going to help you tell the story you want to tell. I don't know. That to me is not an organic method of storytelling. I don't know if he wrote the first book with the intention of doing a second, but if he did, shame on Frank Herbert for not introducing these elements sooner. If he thought the first book was just going to be a standalone novel, then I sort of get it. But either way, it just doesn't quite work. Again, things get weird here, and there's two specific elements in general that are really important to the plot. They play a heavy role. They're just brand new. They're not even mentioned in the first book. It's just too different from the first novel to ever reach the heights of the first without having that foreshadowing in our back pocket. Also, it just needed to be longer. I mean, I mentioned that this is the fourth book in really a 4-book series to this point, 4 different novellas, and this could have been longer. Some of the chapters here are way too short. We get huge chunks of information specifically regarding our antagonist that are glossed over in 1 to 2 sentences regarding their motivations. It's just way too quick. Even the ending is way too quick. I don't know what the purpose was for writing the story like that, but I was disappointed with how little time we spent on certain storytelling elements when there was no real need to rush it. More to that, some of the characters feel wasted, right? Some of these new characters who are introduced, or some of the characters who were brought in book one that don't play major roles here. In fact, some of the characters from book one that we loved that survived the events of the first aren't in this book. They're hardly mentioned, and they don't have any screen time. I don't get that. If he was thinking of doing a later novel where they're going to be back in there, then fine, but isn't the point of a sequel to sort of bring back the people that were so important in the first book? Satisfy your fans a little bit in that respect? I know he wanted to do something different here, but there's some people that could have played parts in this story without changing the plot at all, and at least it would have given us a little bit of fan service. I didn't understand that move. Lastly, there's a lot of things thematically that are just inferred. They're implied in ways that make you really need to concentrate on the source. It's not an easy read. You know, Dune 1's not really an easy read if you want to get the full effect, but the second one's even harder. There's a lot of religious philosophy here too, and you've got to pay attention to this book if you want to really understand it and appreciate it, and some people just aren't going to do that, especially if you're listening to the Audible version, which leads me right into Audible check-in time. Same narrators as the first book, but not nearly the production. The way that they split up these narrators doesn't make a lot of sense. We don't have specific narrators for specific characters. We just seem to plug and play when we want to. And I didn't really get that. It could have used one narrator throughout the whole story. They're outstanding. Every narrator here is great, but there's no rhyme or reason for when they are narrating aspects of the story. So again, I didn't understand that. So overall, is Dune Messiah worth it? I get why certain people love this book. I also get why certain people hate this book. In some ways, it's the perfect sequel. It's darker, it's heavier, it builds on certain mythologies from the first book, and surprisingly, it raises the stakes. It does raise the stakes. On the other hand, the pacing's an issue. The story itself is on a smaller scale, or at least it feels that way at times. And the new elements are just too new for how important they are. I mean, that's my biggest gripe with the novel. I actually think some of these issues will be fixed in a film version if we ever get it. I think that we can focus on these other characters and build on them on screen better than Herbert did in his book. And I also think that we can introduce some of these new aspects in Dune Part 2 when it comes out in October 2023, as was just announced yesterday. If our production team is smart, they will do so that audiences aren't left feeling the same way I do now. I'm optimistic about a film version because there's some really good stuff here. It's a solid sequel, but it's just not as good as the first. All in all, if you love Dune, Messiah is a pretty brisk read that will complete certain story arcs and satisfy you in ways that the first one never could. It's worth the undertaking in that sense. It's just not as good as the first book, so don't expect it to be. It's not the Empire Strikes Back of this series. It's a fine sequel. It's solid, but it's just not as good as Dune. And I don't know that many books are. On the Worthy Meter, I gave Dune Messiah a 70 out of 100, a really solid rating, especially for a sequel, but not nearly that 91 out of 100 that I gave the first book. Thank you so much for joining me on this relatively fast review today, everybody. We're finally moving away from the world of Dune for a little while next time on the channel, and we're gonna get into some horror stories here. Halloween is fast approaching, but if you're still craving that little spooky season scares while fall is still in the air, I got you covered here with our next review, so definitely check that out. Thanks so much, have a great day, enjoy the new backdrop, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot.